my main concern was really to preserve the integrity of the work itself. And so we used a technique called filmograph, which is where the camera moves, but the artwork remains static. And at all times, because of the comics are printed on cheap paper, generally, we went back to the original source, or we had statted the original work to saturate the color. And while the film was shot in 16mm, the animation, which I'll call animation, although it's very limited, was shot in 35mm. What's interesting about the film, I feel, is that it covers the whole medium of comics. This film is not intended as a definitive history of comics. It's more like a profile of artists in the context of history. As you'll see in the film, and by testimonies by some of the artists who are interviewed, there was a real concern that comic books would lead to juvenile delinquency, especially in the 1950s. It's happening today, of course, again. And the idea that comics would lead you down a path where your mind would rot is something that I feel was important to address. The comics of the 1960s, people like Robert Crumb and the other artists in the film, talk about a cultural record of the times, and I feel that comics reflected the times. And if you really want to know what the hate was like, or San Francisco was like, pick up a copy of Zap. The one thing that I wanted to preserve was the integrity of the comics themselves, and so I didn't want to turn it into a Saturday morning cartoon. I didn't want Mel Blanc's voice to come up, and so I had the artists read their work. I was writing a screenplay for Ivan Reitman, who did Ghostbusters, and I was living in Los Angeles, and a friend of mine, Charles Lippincott, suggested that we go to the San Diego comic book convention together. And I had some fascination with comics because earlier that year, another friend of mine, and who this film is dedicated to, B.P. Nickel, showed me his comic book collection, and I knew nothing about comic books. He showed me the work of Art Spiegelman and Linda Berry and Harvey Pekar, and I got very excited about it, and I thought that the medium could be translated into film by preserving the integrity of the work, keeping it static. And after going to the comic book convention with Charlie, I asked him to be the executive producer of the film. Eisner was in the audience, and what I'm about to tell you is that it was the most satisfying experience that I had in making the film, which is that Will came up to me and said, "We no longer have to apologize for being comic book artists, or we don't have to compare comics to literature or film, because what's important, what's exciting, what's great about comics is that they're comics." I think that was the real reason for making this film, was to change people's attitudes, change people's ideas of comic books, that they are a viable and meaningful art form, and that the artists and publishers have known that. Just the rest of the world, I felt needed to know that.